Horse Challenge was an arcade racing game that was first introduced to the PlayStation in 1997. It sees players choosing from several characters who each have their own car. Every one of them has different attributes that make a huge difference once out on the track, so trying out each of them was the best way of ultimately becoming better at the game. However, there was one downside to the experience, that being the amount of tracks that players could race on. There was only 4, which were all based on real-world locations such as the snowy alpine mountaintops to the calm Japanese countryside. For what the game lacked in quantity, it more than made up for in design. Each location offered just as much challenge as the last, with several modes being available as well, such as Classic, which was a much more arcade approach, another called Long, which included shortcuts and other interesting features. But of special note was something known as the interactive mode. This extended the tracks and helped prolong the gameplay by randomizing each location. Visually, it was impressive for its time and was designed exclusively with Porsche, who had a hand in modeling the cars to the exact specification to make the experience as realistic as possible. Although it's not the best racer on the system by any means, it is still one that deserves a spot in any PlayStation owner's collection. Driver is a pretty unique racing game that sees the player taking on the role of an undercover cop known as Rick Tanner. It sees you performing jobs for the criminal underworld, which slowly starts to unravel a surprisingly deep narrative. The first thing to mention is the way in which the experience is set up. There are several locations you'll be visiting throughout the game, from New York to San Francisco and Miami, but each of them are entirely open environments that allow the player to freely take on missions by simply driving to a specific point on the map. It was one of the first games to offer this open-ended approach, and it no doubt contributed to its success in a huge way. What made it challenging when making your way from one location to the next was the inclusion of traffic that you would constantly have to weave in and out of whilst being chased by the police or trying to reach somewhere within a specific time limit. Each mission was lent a real sense of urgency because of it, and made them all just as exciting to play as the last. Speaking of missions, there were several types. From pursuit to timed events, there was plenty of variety, which helped the core gameplay shine. Although its sequel introduced various on-foot sections for the player to undertake, I personally feel that the first outing is the best when it comes to just simply driving. So if it passed you by when it was released, it is still well worth going back and checking out to this day. Crash Team Racing was possibly one of the greatest moves from Naughty Dog. It took on board the best parts of Nintendo's popular Mario Kart and threw them all into a racing experience starring the lovable Bandicoot. Now there are several modes to choose from. You have your standard arcade races, cups and multiplayer. One standout feature though has to be the adventure mode, that sees players exploring the island that the game takes place on. Once out on the track, players have access to a bunch of power-ups, ranging from simple boosts to more offensive options such as nitro crates and rocket launchers that hone in on players to throw them off course. One exception that sets Crash Team Racing apart from the other karting games is the way players are rewarded for catching air and performing drifts. By doing so, the player gains a short boost, and with speed and time management being at the center of the game, the extra boost is always worth it. The visuals fit perfectly with the fun, cartoony aspect that Crash Bandicoot is all about, and it takes on the same classic and bouncy soundtrack that many players love. If you're looking for one of the best multiplayer races on the system, Crash Team Racing is one of the best choices. Destruction Derby 2 made its way to the PlayStation in 1996. It all centered around destruction and chaos rather than the usual racing seen in other titles in the same genre. Although this did not steal enjoyment from the game itself, there's a handful of play modes to pick from, which include stock car racing that sees players battling for first place, but I think the most fun you'll have is in the Destruction Derby mode, which is centered around destroying and eliminating all other cars on the track. There was also Wrecking Racing, which combined the two previous gaming modes into one. One disappointing aspect of the game fell on the limited amount of tracks available. There was only one Destruction Arena and around half a dozen race courses. Sadly, the tracks available were not very interesting either, but what made the title so fun and made up for these shortcomings was the pure chaos that players could take part in. From a visual standpoint, Destruction Derby 2 was technically impressive. The damage could clearly be noticed, as could bits of smashed cars and debris flying about each time you crashed into someone. Overall, the game was a fun and chaotic racer that lacked in design, but still remains as one of the PlayStation's most impressive games. The Wipeout series has always been one of Sony's flagship titles, with many versions of the game releasing over the years. Wipeout 2097 was the second game to release on the PS1, and it managed to take everything from the original and expand and build upon it in so many ways. It's essentially a futuristic take on the racing genre, with a huge emphasis upon speed and the use of weapons. Much like the previous entry, you can expect to find a well thought out and robust campaign mode that slowly deals out extra machines and circuits for you to use in other modes. Once out on the track, Wipeout 2097 truly comes into its own and excels during its second-to-second gameplay. Littered around every track are various boost zones and items that can help turn the outcome of even the most challenging race. But your opponents naturally have access to these abilities as well, which manages to lend an extra layer of strategy to the game. From missiles to deflection shields and lasers, there are many options when it comes to either going on the offensive or playing it safe and holding your position when in front. If you've ever been fond of the series and were hoping to play it on a system where it all began, Wipeout 2097 is a great way to do exactly that. F1 Season 2000 is hands down the greatest Formula 1 racer on the PlayStation. It takes what was introduced in the previous game and includes a multitude of refinements and additions that helps elevate it above being just a mere sequel. You'll find all of the real drivers, teams and tracks of that time, as well as several modes such as Time Trial, GP Weekend, Championship and Versus that are all common to Formula 1 games. But something new that was introduced and helped it stand out was the inclusion of two new features. The first being an interactive training mode that used an announcer to guide you through each of the game's 17 locations. It all focused on speed, braking, racing lines, and even pit strategy. This mode would really help players develop their skills and get used to every aspect of the sport. The second new addition was one that was long overdue, and that was the scenario mode. The game featured 10 real-world scenarios from the 2000 racing season, so you wouldn't just be stuck racing hundreds of laps over the course of the game. These scenarios could range from simple objectives to meeting some downright frustrating criteria that would push your knowledge of the game to the limit, but not to the point where it would feel unfair. As you would expect, once you're out on the track, control is tight and responsive, which is so important for games of this type, and F1 Season 2000 does not disappoint. If you're a fan of the sport and are looking to jump into one of the many F1 games on the system, Championship Season 2000 would be the best choice. The first thing many players will notice upon playing TOCA 2 are the incredible visuals. Obviously they're not as impressive by today's standard, but seeing it up and running on the PlayStation was breathtaking back in the day. At times it could look on par with the likes of Gran Turismo and presents a much more realistic take on the genre. From weather effects to visual car damage, it was a real sight to behold. Of course, this would all mean nothing if the gameplay wasn't just as impressive, but thankfully TOCA 2 nails this aspect as well. Now, controlling each car can be a real challenge, but after spending some time with them, you slowly begin to learn the intricacies of each machine, and soon see yourself slamming them around corners and climbing the ladder in the well thought out and implemented championship mode. It's all spread out over several circuits, such as Donington and Silverstone to name a couple. Now, the challenge it poses is the real star of the show, with the AI opponents managing to hold their own and even surprise you when you least expect it. Naturally, by making your way through it, a generous amount of unlocks can be earned, such as new vehicles and tracks, which will really help prolong your time with the game. Making your way over the steep learning curve may seem daunting at first, but once you get to know it, you'll start to wonder to yourself why you never played it before. 2001 saw the release of Colin McRae 2 on the PlayStation 1. It was heavily influenced by the popular arcade game Sega Rally that found a home on the Sega Saturn in 1995. Although the selection of cars were not too extensive, the choices featured were exceedingly popular among the rally scene. Whilst racing, each of these cars were beholden to an impressive physics engine that was extremely precise in creating a realistic, adrenaline-fueled experience. Colin McRae 2 offered several gaming modes, from rallycross racing, often referred to as arcade, as well as a fully fledged simulation mode. The game also featured Colin McRae's Rally School, in which players would listen to tips and tricks from the rally champion himself that would aid your success on the track. One of the best modes, however, is Championship. It sees all of the other cars being eliminated from the track, and the player must simply race against the clock to win. Now, visually, the game was far from spectacular, but it was nowhere near shoddy. The cars were wonderfully detailed, as well as the courses that emphasized little details that brought each location to life. A nice touch was the splash effect of mud and dirt that accumulated on the car as you drove through it. In my opinion, this has to be the best rally game on the system, and although there's others like V-Rally, I can safely say that Colin McRae 2 will not disappoint you. Ridge Racer Type 4 manages to provide what the series has always gotten right, and that's the arcade feeling at home. Being the 4th iteration of the series, it really felt like a culmination of everything that had been learnt up until that point. And although some might say the game is incredibly easy when compared to the more serious races out there, Ridge Racer is just extremely enjoyable to play. That feeling of drifting around corners at breakneck speeds as the announcer cheers you on in the most cheesiest of ways just never gets old. And with the amount of content and unlockables in which to earn, there's also plenty to do across the several modes of play which are presented. As with most games in the series, a ton of different tracks are available to race on, with each of them possessing their own distinct identity, from the sun-drenched skies of an evening sunset to the neon accents in the city at night. Ridge Racer Type 4 looks like it's definitely punching above the PS1's graphical weight, and it all manages to come together and results in not only one of the best looking racing games on the system, but also one that is packed to the brim with content to enjoy. So if you're looking for an accessible but at the same time rewarding racer on the PS1, Ridge Racer Type 4 more than deserves a spot in your collection as well. Gran Turismo 2 is quite simply the finest racing game on the PlayStation. The clear level of passion and craftsmanship that has gone into the experience is immediately evident. From the wide array of modes to the impressive amount of vehicles in which to race, there is plenty on offer here that is bound to satisfy fans of the sport. As with all Gran Turismo games, the main draw for many will be the simulation mode, which sees you starting out with a small amount of funds in which to purchase a cheap vehicle and begin your racing journey. Over the course of it, you'll find yourself purchasing a whole range of vehicles, tune-up parts and earning licenses that allow you to take on more of what the game has to offer. Now visually, Gran Turismo 2 is a real looker when it comes to racing games on the PS1. It is truly impressive what they managed to squeeze out of the machine. Each location, track and vehicle all come to life in a way not found in many other races on the console. If you're a serious fan of the sport, Gran Turismo 2 on the PS1 is an absolute no-brainer and will likely provide you with hours upon hours of entertainment. Well, that does it for today's video. Don't forget to hit subscribe and follow us on all of the socials to stay up to date on future videos. You can also join our community on Discord and meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation. If you're interested in doing so, you'll find all of these links down in the description. Thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'll catch you next time.